Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, and welcome to Tarjuman, a very special episode of Tarjuman. I'm Matthew Abdul Haq Niami, and I'll be stepping away a little bit from the theology today, and getting more into sort of not quite fiqh perhaps, but just sort of practical questions about the world around us, and that is looking at Islam and socialism. How do these two things? What are these things? How do they interact? How could they interact theoretically? There's been a lot. Well, I will say first of all that as someone raised in the Western education system, um, I found that and then some. I converted to Islam in college, and have been learning more and more about socialism the past few years. Um, I've sort of become aware that Islam and socialism are sort of the two most forbidden knowledges of the West, and by that I just mean that they're sort of left out of the curriculum, if you will, especially granted how especially with an eye to how huge these things are on the stage of world history. It's like amazing, it's shocking and disappointing how little people learn about them in their standard education. Which the more I've been learning about them, the more it's kind of like, well, I guess it's kind of understandable that the Western Empire, who is justifying itself by claiming to be the guardians of capitalism and Christianity, it would make sense they wouldn't want people to understand in good faith the main contenders for those two slots, I guess, of economic system and religion. Um, so so yeah, I wanted to take a crack at filling in gaps in people's knowledge that because of their education system has just totally left these things out or glossed over it and caricatured things. There's plenty of resources out there about Islam that are pretty good, but I wanted to address kind of the intersection of Islam and socialism in particular. I've been pretty disappointed with some of the takes or the attempts to stab at this issue, even from what one would think were reputable Muslim organizations, kind of just sort of sidestepping the issue or dealing with it in just old propaganda stereotypes and just quite unserious attempts at understanding the problem. It's if someone's telling you that, like, oh well, Islam or socialism and capitalism are worldly man-made systems, and Islam is from God, so just don't even worry about those two or something. It's like, well, unfortunately, we live in the world and we have to like deal with these things going on around us, so we can't just be like, oh, we don't live on Earth. We follow God. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? We follow God. We seek to obey Allah and gain His pleasure by working righteousness in this world. And so the question is, how do we do that? That's the question. Let's actually try to understand how we might do that. And in order to do that, we have to understand what's going on around us and what these terms mean and what they that sort of thing. So anyway, let me get into my little presentation here. And I guess I'm putting my cards on the table to an extent here, saying that, I think it's a good thing to try to strive towards an authentic Islamic socialism, which to some may sound odd, but stick around and it'll sound far less odd by the end, God willing, inshallah. So the yeah, let me open my presentation here. Okay, so yeah, here's my kind of roadmap, I guess. And here's my sort of main thesis, I suppose, so you know where I'm going. Early Islam has a lot of similarities with early capitalism. Historical observation shows that market dynamics and wealth accumulation, that is sort of the mathematical dynamics and just the way money flows, and the way wealth accumulates, if left unchecked, will sabotage society. Marxism is a critique of capitalism and a scientific analysis on how to protect society from those toxic that wealth accumulation and market dynamics that are toxic to society, and to better implement European Enlightenment values, or otherwise known as like liberal values, capital L liberal, not in the sense of like Democrats in the United States, but liberal more broadly meaning kind of like freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equality before the law, that kind of stuff. Excuse me. So, if we were to do something analogous in Islam, do some sort of Islamic socialism. Granted, socialism, like we said, it's a Western phenomenon initially, um, uh, um, but was obviously taken up by many people in other parts of the world. But if we were concerned with doing something kind of analogous in the Islamic tradition, it would be to reform Islamic economic law and any other economic law in order to better implement Islamic values. So that's a very broad overview. So now we'll start to get into some of the definitions here, and yeah. Oh well, yeah. So first, just if somebody tells you that Islam and socialism are incompatible because socialism is inherently atheist or something, that's just a red flag that they don't know what they're talking about. Um, Socialism, if they're saying this about socialism, they're obviously thinking of the Soviet Union, which did implement a type of state atheism, but that's just one type of socialism. Um, there are so many, just there's so many other types of socialism, including, for instance, liberation theology, which was a big movement of Christian Catholic Marxists in Latin America, which was kind of rose up in the 60s and 70s and then was suppressed violently by Reagan and other American presidents from the 80s onward. Um, you know, um, and yeah, and those were Christians who basically said, well, Christ commanded us to care for the poor, and Marx is a social theorist that can allow us to understand how to do that better. So there's no contradiction. Um, yeah. if somebody said, if somebody said, oh, do you like Italian food? And you said, no, I'm Muslim. Obviously, that would be like a category error. Like they're not mutually exclusive. Sure, some Italian food might traditionally contain pork or wine, which would be haram. But first of all, there's plenty of traditional Italian dishes that don't contain those things and could be halal easily. Um, or even those things that traditionally contain wine or pork, you could modify them a bit. You could take a traditionally pork sausage and just switch it with halal beef and keep the same spices and everything, and bada bing bada boom, you got yourself a halal Italian sausage. It's still quite Italian. So if anybody tells you that Islam and socialism are incompatible, that's a big category error. Um, they're socialism. Yeah. So anyway, so let's get into a little bit more detail and maybe more precision or detail about the definitions. So capitalism and socialism, they're both rather broad terms. They're both huge traditions. Capitalism, there's lots of different countries that have done capitalism differently. Lots of different movements, and maybe not whole countries. Some countries, yeah, I guess, yeah. There have been countries and movements and thinkers that do socialism in different ways. So these are both rather broad, diverse, almost like little ecosystems of their own, traditions, we could say. And so, yeah, there's a lot of variety within them, but we can say a couple very broad things. Capitalism tends to allow for a very large scope of private property rights. In other words, you can own big stuff. So in capitalism, not only can I own my shirt and my books and my water bottle, and maybe often my house and my car. I can own a street. I can own a bridge. I can own a forest. I can own natural resources. I can own an island. I can own a factory. I can own huge corporations that employ millions of people. I, as a private owner, can have like sole control over that massive thing, even when it's a big part of society. And that is perhaps the kind of the key one of the key differences between capitalism and socialism, where socialism says that large parts of the economy, large parts of society, should not be controlled by one person or a small handful of people. Socialism means the social control of the means of production, meaning the big parts of society that make it chug, the big logistics systems, the one second. And that is one of the key distinctions between capitalism and socialism. That is where socialism means the social control of the means of production. So big stuff that's an important part of society should be controlled by society, not by an individual or a small handful of individuals. Um, and socialists will debate exactly where we draw this line or how this works, but for the most part, socialists will say, yeah, you can own your shirt and your books and whatever, or at least something. Yeah, you can own them in a similar way to how you would in another system. But then when it comes to like houses, maybe and land, definitely, then it gets a little questionable as to whether or not people should be able to own that privately. But they definitely would not be allowed to own privately a factory or natural resources, things like that. And then I guess one other kind of like tendency would be that in capitalism, after it sort of superseded like previous aristocracies and set up rules of the market that are try to be sort of like fair in the sense that they treat everyone equally regardless of their lineage or some such thing. Once those rules are set up, then they have a tendency to like just defer to those rules and let the chips fall where they may, I suppose. Um, Granted, this is sometimes there's a lot of propaganda that gets into this with like, oh, this is the free market, which kind of and there's a lot of weird ideology that goes around with trying to think of the market as being this like natural thing that happens without human choices. But like, of course, a market requires rules to function. Like we get to set up the rules how we want. Um, you can change rules about how does credit work, how do transactions work, what happens with fraud. There's a million things that go into it. Yeah, protections from fraud, protections from making sure contracts are enforced. All these things are rules that human societies set up, and socialism would tend to emphasize the fact that hey, we can change the rules. We don't have to like keep them the way they they already are or what have you. And really, this is again, this is propaganda because capitalists will often, change the rules. The elites of the capitalism, of course, will change the rules to benefit themselves, and then turn around and say, "Oh, this is natural free market stuff, right?" Yeah, okay. Um, so anyway, and and I don't say that to say, "Oh, there is a natural free market or something that they're not doing." It's just that the concept of a free natural market doesn't make sense. A market is a bunch of people getting together, deciding how to trade things, and setting up rules for how to do it. So anyway, that's my, that's why these two things are not just like chocolate and vanilla. They're like one when you think about it and understand what's going on. One is obviously more correct. Socialism is obviously more correct. I mean, you can quibble about what type of socialism or something, but like these broad distinctions, these major distinctions between socialism and capitalism, where the elements that they sort of fundamentally differ on, socialism is just clearly correct once you understand it. The idea that like these things are left and right wing politics are just sort of like, oh, chocolate and vanilla, which one do you like? It's okay, they're equal, blah blah blah. It's propaganda anyway from the elites, but we'll get into that more maybe. Now, Marxism is basically, Marx was the first to sort of take was basically the first to use social science to analyze what was going on with capitalism and try to understand why all this inequality in social classes was arising, and propose a plan for like fixing it. And he actually had, you know, much of the same values, again those liberal values, those European Enlightenment values. He had the same values as the people who generally champion capitalism, but he was just the first to actually use like actually think carefully about, well, how, if we want to actually implement these values, how might we do that better? um, so it's, granted, there are later types of socialism which are illiberal, you know, in the sense of um, pushing back against civil rights, or individual liberties, for instance. And that's what tends to get called communism. Marx didn't use it that way, and yes, initially Marx used it as an idealized end state where social class would wither away and the state would wither away. But then later states like Soviet Russia, etc., kind of used this term communism to brand themselves as like, we are the utopian implementation of this, you know, perfect state or whatever. And obviously they were not too careful about civil rights. And so so nowadays communism tends to refer to like types of socialism that are more okay with powerful states that give less civil liberties, we could say, generally. But I mean, there are some people that use it differently, but I would say that's generally how people use it. Okay, so let me continue. Whoops, that was all right. Now, to kind of understand where I'm coming from with this whole like Islam and capitalism stuff, we have to talk a little bit about, you know, I guess this is one of the major sort of social science, just historical observations that Marx and other socialists have made, which is essentially that, you know, it's the kind of the dynamic of like the game of Monopoly. You know, you set up the rules for the market, and if you don't change the rules at all, you'll tend to get this, or if you don't fight it, you'll tend to get these rich get richer and poor get poorer dynamics. And I like to analogize it as this, like matter and space, and this is why, because power if you have power, it tends to allow you to get more wealth. If you have more wealth, it allows you to get more power. You can buy a radio station and blast your ideology. You can buy, you know, you can bribe a politician to implement rules that favor you, that let you get more money, and then you can use that more money to buy more politicians and more radio stations and blah blah. So there's this kind of feedback loop where power and wealth kind of create more and more power and wealth. If not, you know, if there's no concerted effort to stop this. And you know, this is why socialism says we cannot let people privately own big stuff, because then you're just asking for this type of accumulation. So the analogy I like to think of is matter in space, because matter also has this kind of feedback loop effect where matter in space will attract other matter. Like, say you start off with a nebula, everything's kind of gas, everything's spread out, just swirling around in space. But then over time, as matter clumps up, you know, matter attracts matter, which then clumps up, it gets heavier and denser, and then it makes more gravity, which then pulls in more matter, which gets heavier and denser, pulls in more matter, gets heavier and denser, until you get like, you know, solar systems, galaxies, and black holes, where you have like so much matter condensed into small places, and then big empty spots. So you can think of this as like, you know, there are, you know, times in history where you have these sort of, where wealth and power gets spread out and is swirling around, is dynamic, relative to other times. And then with time, you know, if left unchecked, it will tend to accumulate and clump until you get like a black hole situation, where it's like a few people are extremely wealthy and powerful, and everybody else is just empty space. Is like they have very little. And I would argue that early capitalism and early Islam were one of these kind of early relatively nebulous egalitarian phases in human society, where things got relatively spread out. And so and here's some I won't go too much into detail about the rise of capitalism. You can learn about that more easily elsewhere, but I'll just point out like the similarities because people are probably not as familiar with this. But early Islam, like capitalism, had kind of an egalitarian ethos and an equality before the law. So it didn't matter if you were part of a noble family or whatever position you held in like a previous empire or something. If you become a Muslim, you're a Muslim. You have like full rights, equality before the law, and you can access all these things like education, military stipends. So people who previously had nothing, who were just nobodies, could join the military, or go into education, and kind of through meritocratic ends and other things, rise in the ranks or just get a decent stipend. So um, the like for instance in the like third generation of Islam. So the first generation was it obviously started among Arabs, so it was primarily all Arab. Vast majority of early Muslims were Arabs, but then as they conquered people and then other people started to convert. These people would join the religion, kind of gain full rights, and start rising in the ranks. And like the third generation or so, people were kind of getting there was some kind of tension rising because these non-Arabs who were the grandchildren of like conquered peoples were now becoming all the like heads of academies and the great scholars and things like that. And the Arabs were kind of like, hey, this is our club where we started this. So there was this kind of tension that happened because of that social mobility. And again, you can see this is very similar to like the bourgeoisie, the who were the heralds of capitalism, and opposing the previous aristocracy. Another kind of similarities, you had a sort of communitarian freedom of religion. Religious minorities were given explicit legal rights, and even under Islamic rule, the leaders of the religious minorities were delegated state power to like manage internal affairs. They had their own court system. They could collect taxes from their community to build their mosques, build their synagogues and churches, etc. And then similar to the bourgeoisie, they were wealthy. The European bourgeoisie were wealthy not because they were aristocrats, but because they were tradespeople and merchants who were accumulating wealth, and eventually, by being just as wealthy, if not more wealthy than the aristocrats and the kings, were able to say to them, "Hey, if you want if you want our money, you're going to have to allow us to participate in the decision-making process," and that's how parliaments started. And so that didn't not quite the same thing happened in Islamic history, but you did have a prominent class of lots of merchants and tradespeople who were very much involved in some of the early ruling families were merchant families, like the Umayyads started as like a merchant family, wealthy merchant family. And like so they set up this big network of markets and business partnerships and standardized trade network where people could do business ventures from Morocco to China, and with all the same business law, have their credit respected, same currency, all these kind of things. So very like conducive to free trade, free enterprise kind of stuff. And then things just became less tribal, less local, and more kind of cosmopolitan networks with a large society managed through a large state. You can kind of see the parallel to Europe as well, in the sense that whereas in more less egalitarian or less kind of like, I don't know what to call it. In other systems, you often have like local rule where it's like if you're in a village and the local elders don't like you for some reason, they can sort of screw you over and like stop you from engaging in business or boycott you or something. But like in these type of systems, in early capitalism and in early Islam, the change was sort of like, well, now you can sort of just go over their heads and like maybe take them to court, or because you have all the same rights as everyone else does, or you can they can't stop you from exercising your rights because your rights are given to you by a larger state as opposed to like just a local warlord or whatever. So so these are all kind of like similarities to between early Islam and early capitalism. But like any system, over time they start to, because they didn't because they allowed for private ownership, or rather, uh, um, I guess, well, the Islamic system did also, it didn't allow for as much private ownership, but it did allow for some. And there's different ways of accumulating wealth and power other than just like the same exact capitalist ownership model. But there again, there's that tendency of like the galaxy where things by direct and indirect means, the elites tend to, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So in the case of Muslim economies, you had you started to get elite families, or the big economic players later in the Middle Ages were, rather than being, having dynamic goods and services flying around, you more and more tended to get like the big economic players are people who are just collecting, are just farming taxes off of like a piece of land. Like they would be designated, the Khalifa would designate them, give them a piece of land which they were in charge of collecting taxes from, and they would get a cut of it or what have you. So that, yeah, so the economy kind of like stagnates a bit, and that kind of, I think, contributes to like why Europeans were able to conquer them, in part, because of this, you know because this dynamic, this phase, this process, or this pattern of the explosion of egalitarianism, dispersed wealth and power, and then over time clumping and stagnating. The Muslim world actually kind of like went through this cycle before the West did, and so the Muslim world was kind of like on the downward accumulation trajectory into a rent economy when the Europe was rising in like the early modern period, and that was kind of like what allowed Europe to colonize the world, along with just what technology was available, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, so yeah, and so now the West, we find ourselves kind of descending into a rent economy increasingly, um, and I guess, yeah, because yeah, so we have to. I want to do a little bit of a perspective check here into reminding ourselves that if you grew up in the West like I did, particularly in the United States, we've been sort of indoctrinated and propagandized into a very extreme form of capitalism. Like we're actually in a rather unusual, historically unusual situation, where like if you take any, yeah, so like our type of capitalism is so, which is called neoliberalism, or neoconservatism, where there's like, yeah, where capital dynamics, money is just allowed to flow so freely without any checks or protections against the toxic dynamics, um, that when we hear just about any other system, if we hear stuff from any other system in history, often it sounds like half communist to us. But that's just because of the unusual situation we live in, where since the '80s in particular, with Reagan again and such, those guardrails that capitalism used to have to like slow down the accumulation of wealth and those toxic effects are being ripped off, torn off. So for instance, the top marginal tax rates in the U.S. from 1944 to 1963 used to be over 90% on income over $200,000. And to us, that just sounds insane, right? Like we're like, what? I thought that less government regulation and less taxes is what makes a prosperous economy, and it's elite propaganda, guys. It's elite propaganda. Please just stop. Like, it doesn't make any sense anyway. But yeah, um, just to kind of give us a little bit of a wake up call there, or like antitrust enforcement, like we're another protection that capitalist countries often have to protect themselves from these toxic dynamics of capital, is to have antitrust laws. That is, breaking up large monopolies. Like when companies tend to gobble each other up and grow bigger and bigger and dominate the market, you have laws that allow you to come in and break them apart. And they don't enforce it anymore. I mean, last time they enforced it again was like the '80s or something. Uh, Now it's Disney and Warner Brothers control like all media between the two of them pretty much. Um, All right. Yeah, and so if you look at any random system from another time or place, like a lot of ancient cultures had customs about if you had agriculture, you were expected to share with the poor in a certain way. Like in the Bible, it talks about not cutting the corners of your field so that the poor could come and take what they needed from that. In the Quran, it's mentioned pre-Islamic Arabs would, I believe it was like before, like in the very early morning, the poor were allowed to come and take what they needed before the main kind of like stewards or whatever managers of the orchard would come and harvest. Also, you'll find in like ancient Greek stuff, like in Odysseus, is it the Odyssey? You'll see traces of this as well as in ancient Jewish culture. There's an idea that like banquets, wedding banquets, and other banquets that the poor that they're sort of public, and the poor can show up and are expected to be given hospitality and fed at the banquet. Um, and like there's a hadith of the Prophet peace be upon him that says, the worst of food is the food of a banquet where the wealthy are invited to it and the poor are left out, for instance. And then you had things like jubilee years in the Bible, in ancient Israelite law. Every 49 years or so, they would just abolish all debt. What's it called? Abolish the debt? Yeah, basically. And then Mesopotamian kings would also, like, when a new king rose to the throne, he would like celebrate by declaring all debts absolved. And then, like, Adam Smith, who's sort of thought of as the father of capitalism, he believed in some small, some banking regulation, and he also just thought he thought that more like crazy, like more risky behavior of banks. He thought banks would just not do it out of rational self-interest. Unfortunately, he turned out to be wrong, as we know from like the 2008 financial crisis. But yeah, if he saw what was going on today, he would be like, "This is super irresponsible. This is not what I meant." He was mostly just pushing against like unfair aristocratic laws from the mercantilist system that he was sort of like pushing against. And then there's another hadith from the Islamic tradition that al Muslimun shuraka fi thalath, al kala'i wal ma'i wal nar, meaning that the Muslims are partners in three: pasture land, meaning where you let your livestock go and feed off the grass, etc. Water, like sources of water, wells and waterways, etc. And fire, meaning places where you get firewood or fuel from. So basically, what this meant is that say you had a forest, you could go and benefit from it. You could gather firewood. You could bring it into the city and sell it. So you could access and put work into these things, but you couldn't own the forest. No person could own the forest and say, "Oh, nobody can go in the forest unless they pay me," or something like that. And same with water and pasture land. And this is actually there was something analogous to this in Europe, and in particular, I can mention in England there was something called the commons, and I imagine this was something common in a lot of places in the world where you had just common land where the peasants would rely on that for hunting and taking care of a lot of their needs without resorting to trading in a market or using currency or anything. But then one of the aspects of the rise of capitalism was what they called the enclosure of the commons, where they started fencing these things off and saying, "Oh, this land actually belongs to the Lord, and you can't access it anymore. Now you have to go work a job and get money to get stuff that you normally would have just like hunted for yourself or something." Um, yeah. So, yeah. So don't buy the propaganda that capitalism as it is just some sort of like natural eternal thing or something. Um, what did we leave out? Okay, so now I guess I wanted to speak a little bit to the issue of authenticity in Islamic socialism, or in general. Authenticity it can often be a bit of a toxic or ill-conceived notion because sometimes it's just meant to like invalidate people. It's used to invalidate people because they don't conform to some imaginary purity test or whatever. Or sometimes it's like sometimes it's just this sort of self-defeating idea of like, well, we can't get any new ideas. Like we can only work with the ideas we have or something. And this is just not a you know this is not a helpful understanding of authenticity. Even when we looked at the Prophet peace be upon him, he would talk about there's many things he would say to this effect of like seeking knowledge wherever you can find it. Poetry is both good and bad. Take the good and leave the bad. And this is pre-Islamic poetry he's talking about from non-Muslims. And this one actually I thought was really interesting. One that I found in the process of researching for this. It was a narration that the Prophet ﷺ said, I intended to prohibit suckling during pregnancy, but I considered the Greeks and the Persians and saw that they practiced it without any injury being caused to their children thereby. So he initially had this kind of like maybe cultural gut reaction that like, oh, this is improper or something. But then he was like, well, he looked at these other people. They're not Muslims, and he saw that it's not harming anything. So he said, okay, I guess it's fine. So yeah, he's just using reason and observation like the question of authenticity of like, oh, is this from Islam or not or something like that. As long as it's adhering to Islamic values, it like it doesn't matter in that case. I guess the way that authenticity could one useful or good way I think we could understand authenticity is just making sure we're engaging with the tradition in good faith in the sense of like yeah, it would be authentic if I were to take Marx and say like, oh, this is the new Islamic. If I was just to literally copy paste Marx's writings and say, oh, this is the new Islamic economic system or something, when there's no engagement with previous Islamic thought, like yeah, that would be weird. That would not make sense. But we could take his ideas. We could, you know, see what is universalizable or what is generalizable. Maybe look at some of his things and say, oh, maybe this only makes sense because has certain. Maybe some of his ideas are because he's in a European context. He's from a Christian background or Jewish background, I should say. Um, you know, the yeah, maybe times have changed, as places are changing. And so things need to be adjusted. But we again, you take the good and leave the bad, and that's exactly what like socialists in Russia and China did. And there's nothing unsocialist about that. Just in this case, that there's Muslim scholars are always critiquing previous scholars, building on previous scholars. And all referring to working on taking Islamic values and the fundamental scriptures, and then coming up with new ways of understanding and implementing those things in a new time and place. And that's perfectly Islamic to do, right? So we shouldn't get too hung up on the authenticity issue, except just make sure we're I think it's always good to start with the tradition to kind of look, just at least to know what they've said in the past, because there's a lot of smart, wise people saying things, and if you don't benefit from that, you're sort of missing out on a great opportunity to have a good starting point and learn and step out of your own kind of contemporary assumptions and thinking. So let's see. I did this part. Did I skip anything here? Yeah, okay, I got that. Now, all right. So now here's where we can get into sort of like Islamic economic values if we were to. Actually, no, let me do this first. Let me go to this. Okay. So now Islamic finance today. Before we even get into the concept of like Islamic socialism per se, let's just even start with kind of like looking to just historically how Muslim economies functioned back in the Middle Ages, and just like kind of looking at if we were to seriously try to implement that nowadays, what would it look like? And this will very quickly disillusion us of any sense, any of this nonsense that religion is like right wing or something. The way, like for instance, the Republican Party in the United States and other places as well seems to try to tie like neoconservative economics up with religion. It's absolutely absurd. Like, the type of things that if you were going to seriously try to implement Sharia economic law nowadays are incredibly left. From the right left spectrum is a little bit anachronistic. It doesn't exactly. It's a little odd to apply that spectrum to Islamic stuff because it was a different place in history. But like this, just look at this list here. If you were to do this, if you were to advocate for this kind of things, this is farther left than the left wing of the. This is like Bernie Sanders. This is farther left than Bernie Sanders. This is farther left than anybody in the Democratic Party right now. Just to give you kind of perspective on this, like, yeah, anybody trying to equate right wing and religion, let alone Islam or Christianity, is just absolutely absurd if you know anything about history. But okay, now I'm getting excited about that. So, so yeah, if we were to seriously want to try to implement some features of classical Islamic economics, we would do things like abolish interest and speculation. You know, all these sort of financial shenanigans that are, creating imaginary money and then selling it for real money and sort of sucking up the economy so that there's less and less money circulating in things that actually benefit people, and more of it is, yeah, just getting caught up in these silly financial mechanisms, and accumulating wealth and power to the elites. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And then you would have to abolish for-profit corporations. You in Islamic finance, Islamic economic law, you could have business partnerships while you're alive, but you couldn't have eternal for-profit corporations building up wealth and power generation after generation. You could do a business partnership. You could get wealthy off that, and then when you died, your wealth would be distributed to your spouse and your children and other relatives, according to the Quran. So that was one way in which Islamic law kind of kept a check on extreme wealth accumulation. Granted, there were like elite families and stuff, but it was obviously families don't always stick together exactly, and sometimes they have different ideas of what they should do with the money, et cetera, et cetera. So, you can imagine it wasn't quite as cohesive as like a corporation that just like has the money. They did have awqaf, which are essentially nonprofit foundations, and usually were kind of designated. They were kind of given bylaws, or a charter that like said like, okay, this waqf is going to make money this way, and the money is going to be used for building a library or a hospital or an aqueduct or feeding the poor or whatever. So that's, well, of course they're human institutions. They're not perfect, but they're far preferable to having eternal for-profit corporations that are, taking over your society. And then you would do things like nationalize natural resources, as I mentioned. With the Muslims are partners in three: pasture land and fire and water. And then, and before I get to those other points, I just wanted to say, like, perhaps I was just thinking about what would be some of the modern equivalents what modern systems could we say are like closest to the Islamic model. And I mean, again, of course, it's not exact parallel because there's everything nowadays is quite capitalist and whatnot, and has interests and things like that. So of course they're not Islamic systems, but vaguely maybe the similar vibes or structure might be something like, maybe like the East, maybe like Singapore. Like China's a little bit too centralized. So yeah, I think I get. Based on my limited knowledge, I would guess maybe something like Japan or Singapore or something like that, where you do have a lot of free market stuff, but you also have a lot of like cultural and state power kind of tamping down on the more toxic dynamics of capital accumulation, and trying to like make sure the wealth generated is like being used for society. So these 2 points right here. These are where I really where we would kind of get into the Islamic socialism aspect. Oh, and actually, let me just go over the value. So yeah, if the equivalent of Islamic socialism is to kind of implement Islamic values in a better way, where did they go? Here, and this is obviously like the ones that I'm picking the ones that tend to be sort of similar to socialism, just because those are the ones that sort of need addressing because we're having this problem of wealth accumulation, wealth inequality. But there's a lot of things in Islamic economics, or Islamic values, such as in the Quran, where there's the idea that none of this stuff like our money and whatnot, does not ultimately belong to us. It is Allah's, it is God's, and He has entrusted us with it. So Surah Al Hadid, for instance, says, "Believe in Allah and His Messenger, and spend from what He has entrusted you with." Yeah, this idea also, this idea of, the money has to be spent, it has to be circulating around. Here in Surah At-Tawbah, we have give glad tidings, or give tidings of a painful torment to those who hoard gold and silver and do not spend it in Allah's cause. So in other words, money that's not circulating and benefiting the society is bad, and should be punished in the hereafter, if not in this life as well. And then equality before the law is another just thing that I threw in there because that kind of has a parallel with Western liberal values of, the Prophet ﷺ said, "By God, if Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, stole, I would cut off her hand." Meaning, so even being the daughter of the Prophet himself, and so being sort of like the most prestigious family in the whole system, like the law still applies to her the same. Very, very similar to like the bourgeoisie kind of anti-aristocratic value. And then we have explicitly in Surah Al-Hashr, it talks about as for gains granted by Allah and His Messenger from the people of other lands, so like war booty, or actually this is fay, I believe, which is a little bit different from war booty, but it's like from things that are extracted from conquered lands. It is for Allah and the Messenger, His close relatives, the orphans, the poor, and the needy travelers, so that wealth may not merely circulate among your rich. So this idea that wealth should not be allowed to just circulate among the rich, very Quranic value right there. Then zakat, we should recall, is a wealth tax, which is something quite left, right? It's very, we would in today's parlance, we would think of that as a very left thing, left-wing politics kind of thing to do, where it's an attempt to sort of crack down on wealth accumulation and basically take and redistribute wealth. And then just another kind of general value of this anecdote that I like is Umar ibn al-Khattab, who is the second successor to the Prophet, peace be upon him. He passed by an old man begging, and he asked him, "To which of the people of the book do you belong?" And he said, "I am a Jew." And he replied, "What has compelled you to do that which I see," meaning begging? And he said, "I am begging in order to pay the jizya, the tribute head tax, on account of my need and old age." So Umar took hold of his hand and took him to his house and gave him something from his home, and then sent him to the treasurer of the Bayt al-Mal, the state treasury, and said, "Take care of this man and other similar men. By Allah, we have not done justice to him that we took jizya, the tribute tax, from him when he was young, but we forsook him when he was old." So I really love this. It has this, first of all, it just has this value of like economic dignity and like, that people deserve, as if they're a part of society, they're contributing to society, they like should be taken care of. And then also just this idea of like, he says, "this man and other similar men." So it's like, it's not just this one-off little thing that I'm doing. It's, if our system is creating this, we need to correct for that. Like, it's on us. If we're in charge of the system, it's on us to make sure that this doesn't happen. This sort of very kind of like society focused, like the economy is not, we're not running society for the sake of the economy. The economy is run for the sake of society, so that people can be taken care of. So they're not afraid for their lives and welfare, and so that they can focus on worshiping Allah, things like that. So if we were to, so taking all those kind of values and then kind of some ideas for what we could call an Islamic socialism, or you can call it whatever you want, but something equivalent would be, for instance, either raising the rate of zakat. Usually, it's the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is that it's 1/40th of your excess wealth, whatever is your net income, and generally that's understood to be like a universal, generalizable number. That's always the case. Maybe you could argue that it could be changed because nowadays wealth accumulates so much faster. Back in that time of the Prophet ﷺ, if you wanted to make a large transaction, you had to buy, 100 Persian rugs and then carry them across the desert in a caravan or what have you. nowadays you can exchange $1 billion with the press of a button. So these toxic wealth accumulation and inequality dynamics just happen so much faster. So you could argue maybe we just need to raise the zakat rate. If you say no, we can't change the zakat rate because it's that 1/40th number is like set in stone. That's divine, eternal law. Then we could say, well, we would just have to say, well, due to state interest and this interest of society, we have to have zakat and then also an additional wealth tax on top of that, because that's something like that is the only way you can really prevent the accumulation of wealth, along with really cracking down and limiting ownership. So no owning large means of production stuff, because that just leads to inequality. And we can debate out exactly how big of stuff we can allow people to kind of privately own, but that's more of a detail. But I think you get the general thrust. In conclusion, left is best, and it's not so. The idea of left and right being these sort of like symmetrical flavors that you just you can, they're equal or yin and yang or something like that. That's elite propaganda. Basically, right wing politics are generally about allowing the elites to increasingly and faster accumulate wealth and power, and thus create more and more inequality. And left wing is generally pushing the opposite, trying to push for more equality. And like, for true freedom, you need at least ballpark equality, because like, just to give an example, if we're making a contract or a bargain or something, and if I'm desperate and you're wealthy, then $1,000 is worth a lot more to me than it is to you. So fair free exchange really is only possible when people are at least kind of ballpark equal. It doesn't have to be, perfectly like everyone's the same income exactly or something. But those are details we can work out. But anyway, but the point is, you need to really have freedom. You need at least ballpark equality. And things like, there's all sorts of situations where we give up little bits of freedom to get bigger freedom dividends. Like you might, I give up my right to drive my car wherever I want on grass and crossing lines and all sorts of things, in exchange for the freedom of being able to drive safely wherever I go, and being a lot less likely to die in a car crash. Things like that. Or I give up my freedom of, people have to get a driver's license or whatever. So yeah, and then again, I think I sort of talked about this at the beginning, but like spiritual bypassing, where we say, oh, we're too spiritual to deal with these questions, or these are man-made systems, so we shouldn't bother with them. It's kind of like, that's just such a cop-out. You're just ceding power to the worst of people if you don't engage and seriously deal with, like, okay, what are our options? What are we working with here? What's going on around us? How are we to interact with it? If you're not seriously dealing with those questions, then yeah, you're just letting the worst people take the reins, and they're going to make it even worse. And maybe we'll be asked about whatever capacities we have, we're going to be asked about that on the day of judgment, whether it's voting or even just like learning about these things and speaking truth to people and educating each other on these kind of things. So that's, inshallah, I hope this is beneficial for myself and others, and I hope we can, all people who believe in God or even just in doing good things in society, I hope we can work together. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.